Hi, this is Aaron Wilson. Listening to Nick Caserio at his annual draft press conference, there's not a lot of concrete information to be gleaned from it. There are a few clues, there are a few key takeaways, and obviously you go into this with the understanding that as the general manager and the person that's responsible for who they draft and don't draft and the trades, that you're not going to reveal your hand. It's chess, not checkers. It's a game of poker. And yes, people read these transcripts, but there were some things to take away from what Nick said. And, starting off pretty quickly, there's a willingness to trade. And I think he wanted to advertise that he's willing to move up or down from number 25. That's not a big surprise. If you look at Nick's history of trades, he loves to trade, loves to maneuver, loves to navigate up and down within the draft. That's something that's kind of a hallmark of Nick Caserio, aggressive general manager, and willing to wheel and deal, and willing to sometimes give us some points on the Jimmy Johnson trade chart and others if he is doing that to get the player that he wants. And that was the case with Will Anderson Jr., and that paid off pretty well. With Will being the Defense Rookie of the Year and a Pro Bowl selection. So these are things that keep in mind about Nick, and obviously everybody pays attention to everything. So there's some things to kind of learn from his draft track record. And I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room at all. Let's talk about the offensive line. So Nick inherited Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard. Laramie acquired during the Bill O'Brien, Jack Easterby era, and then they got Titus Howard as the first-round draft pick for Brian Gaine, so when he was general manager. And no, they did not want Andre Dillard. I have so many people ask me this over the years. And they were right. They got the pick right. Titus Howard, much better player than Andre Dillard, who never panned out. So looking at the offensive line, and he was asked some pointed questions, some fair questions about whether he needs to change things about how he evaluates the offensive lineman. And here's why. Kenyon Green, 15th overall pick, had to trade him. Total bust, didn't work out. Juice Scruggs, jury remains out on him as a second-round pick. He hasn't necessarily, gotten a clear picture out of Blake Fisher, the second-round pick from last year, but it doesn't look like it's, like he's heading to the Pro Bowl. Certainly, he's got a chance to improve. I think he has, some upside still. Looking over at, getting Shaq Mason and giving him a big contract after they traded for him, and then hitting the wall in year 2 after a pretty solid first season. Another one. So, the track record, not great. Then he trades Laramie Tunsil, replaces him with Cam Robinson. He acquires Laken Tomlinson, whose best years are behind him. He's known for his durability and leadership, but it's been a while since he was in the Pro Bowl. And Ed Ingram, who's an underachieving second-round pick for the Vikings. Cam Robinson was actually benched by the Jaguars and then did a good job as the stand-in for Christian Darrisaw. And then Trent Brown is coming off a big injury. And you get the point. There's problems with the offensive line. There are, no real surefire answers. And this brings us to where they go in the draft. And I'm told that they would like to get a couple of offensive linemen. Not necessarily have to be the first-round pick, but why not dive into it right away? And, Nick was asked a question about a small school lineman that did visit Gray Zabel, North Dakota State, probably projects to guard or center. And he said, everything's case by case. He brought up Kyle Duggar, who's from a small school and did well for the Patriots. But, generally, Nick has had this aversion to drafting from small schools, preferring the Power 5, especially the Southeastern Conference and the Big Ten Conference. So looking at where Nick is in terms of drafting a Gray Zabel, it seems like unless they feel like he's absolutely special and surefire guy, that rare commodity coming from a small school, and maybe he is. I think he's pretty good. I think the Senior Bowl, and that was brought up to him. And Zabel's name never came up, but that was the player that the conversation was about. So everything's kind of reading between the lines. So there's a theme to this, and that's why we have to be analytical about what's said, what's not said. So, he really likes that they have 4 picks in the top 89 selections. That ammunition of the third-round pick makes it easy to go up. In my opinion, this is the time to be aggressive because this is a depth draft and there's very little top quality. There's a difference between some of these players. So if you have to move up to get a Booker or Kelvin Banks or Matthew Golden, if you want to go wide receiver, then he's got the ammunition to do it. He's got 2 third-round draft picks. He can maneuver. He doesn't have a 4th-round pick. That's the only round he doesn't have a selection. He's got 7 draft picks. So if you came out of this with quality potential starters, let's say 3 guys, maybe it's a wide receiver later like Kyle Williams or Trey Harris. What if they were able to get Jalen Noel? What if they were able to maneuver that way to get a good wide receiver and not have to reach in the 1st round? So looking at where they are as a team, there still needs to be a lean toward the offensive line. And then you got to have contingency plans. What if the board gets wiped out and there's no Banks, there's no Booker? Maybe you're choosing between Gray Zabel, Donovan Jackson, Emeka Egbuka, and Kenneth Grant. Would Kenneth Grant from Michigan possibly be the highest graded player still available, even though he's a little inconsistent? He's going to do well. He's a good football player. Could rise the defense to a different level. But do they really need him? Offensive line, regardless of what he said about not drafting for need, you never want to have to draft for need. That was my question about how free agency set the stage for not having to draft for need, because they do have, obviously they can line up. They have linemen. We're just talking about quality. And I look at it and I think with the linemen he has, sure, it's maybe if they coach them up, it could be okay. But I think they got to find a starter. And I think they need someone that's going to be a starter down the road. Maybe it's a player that can play guard initially and then take over at left tackle. Josh Connolly Jr. from Oregon would fit that bill. And so would a player that I talked to today, and we'll get into more in a separate video, about Donovan Jackson, who played left tackle, who played left guard, All-American from Ohio State. Very clean prospect, very good football player, very smart guy, has a lot going for him. So you look at everything with the Texans, and there were some other areas that we did get into. We talked about wide receiver, and he tried to emphasize, that they have a good football team and that they're going to try to continue to add to that position. Wasn't really, he's fairly non-committal about it. And that's what we kind of expected Nick to be. And going over some of the other, things in terms of what they're doing. Obviously the contracts that came up, the recent deals for Jalen Petrie, $42.6 million. Derek Stingley Jr., $90 million. Nico Collins last year, $75 million. And we've been talking about this. We've had a lot of content about the pattern and the philosophy of draft, develop, and then reward. And he feels like all of those guys will handle the money, the generational wealth very well. And ultimately, that is what it's about. You want to leave something behind. You want to, have something for your family. And I think, that's important. And so that came up. That was something that was interesting to hear from Nick. And obviously they wouldn't have done the deals if they didn't feel good about them. So sort of a mastering the obvious kind of thing there. But that's what these press conferences are about. It's not necessarily a news conference. It's just sort of like, let's talk about topics. I asked about running back because, as you guys know, Quinshon Judkins has visited. Travion Henderson's had a Zoom with the Texans. And they've also had in Caleb Johnson from Iowa for a visit, and Brashard Smith from SMU for a visit. So they've been putting some resources into these running backs. And while, they have a Pro Bowl back in Joe Mixon, I'm told they would like to add a speed back. Jaden Blue was another visit to go with Joe Mixon. So that's something that they're interested in. That was something they told Jaden Blue, that the Texans would like to add a running back. So interesting conversation. And there's another video. You can listen to my conversation with Jaden Blue from today. He was out working with the Acres Home Bulldogs, giving a pep talk to a little league team. So it was good to spend time with him. And interesting, just, he loved his visit to the Texans, and he thought it was a good trip. Also heard that they have some good wings at NRG Stadium. Good to know. I'd like to try those wings. So if anybody's out there listening, want to save me some of those wings from NRG Stadium, I'm interested. But I digress. Just kidding around. But yeah, no, not joking. I'll take the wings. Anyway, you look at the slot receiver position, because some of these guys do play in the slot. and Christian Kirk is primarily a slot receiver. So they have him, he does move around, but he also does play a lot of slot. So would they look at someone, they did this a lot with players that could play the slot, could also play outside with the Patriots, with Danny Amendola, with Julian Edelman. So they move those guys around. They're trying to get matchups. And I think they're going to be, like Nick Haley, the offensive coordinator, said, a matchup team, meaning the game plan is going to change all of the time. So I look for that to continue. And, Tank Dell, probably not worth a whole video, but let's talk about Tank Dell. So as you guys know, he had a gruesome injury. It's been repaired twice. He's had his ACL reconstructed successfully, I'm told, by Dr. Walter Lowe. Dr. Walter Lowe also, after the doctors in Kansas City, they put the kneecap back in place from when it was dislocated in that December injury. But he also tore his lateral collateral ligament too. And basically, they thought there was more damage to the meniscus initially than really there was. So he was fortunate about that he still got some meniscus there. And that cartilage is important because you have to be able to stop and cut. But yeah, they were non-committal on whether he's going to play this year. Said he's making progress and in good spirits. So that's pretty much the party line. And expect that to be repeated whenever anyone wants to ask a question about it. But here's what I expect. He will be on the physically unable to perform list, possibly the reserve one, to start training camp. Then he will shift to injured reserve, and they can designate him for return if they want to at some point late in the season, but I don't think that it makes sense for him to play given the injury happening in December and the severity of the injury. So maybe he's a medical miracle and he'll play, but I'm told the plan is, and there's some pushback to even trying to play him. And obviously he wants to play, but that's, I think, just doesn't make sense. And it's not like he's going to go out there necessarily and get injured again, but when's he going to be able to run and cut at a good level to where you feel comfortable putting him out there so he can win matchups? Nick was asked a question about mistakes, and he smiled and laughed, and I think he dropped an F-bomb. And Nick is a guy that will cuss every now and then, but generally not in press conferences. I don't think that he was losing it or getting too frustrated or too defensive. I thought he handled it. He was fairly self-deprecating. Does anyone like to have their mistakes pointed out? No. And he said, you guys have to talk about them all the time. So I don't know. I think that he gets the normal amount of criticism compared to most general managers. And it's not like he's the Mavericks GM, having to be crucified for the Dokic trade. So, you look at, kind of going through the board and just talking about the draft, and he called it a crapshoot. And he's right. You don't know how the board's going to fall. So he looks for inside information. He looks for mock drafts that maybe have information out there. There are some guys that do have some information sometimes, like Daniel Jeremiah. We used to play pickup basketball with Daniel when he was a national scout for the Ravens, and DJ is